Well, thank you very much. Good morning from my side. My name is Martin Pehnt from the Heidelberg-based Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. And I would like to start where you, Alexander, stopped. I would like to focus on the surrounding policy instruments that are necessary or that could help to support the iBRoad approach. What we assume is that there is some kind of energy audit, energy consultancy scheme like the renovation roadmap in place. There are energy auditors available in the country who go on site, who visit the building, who prepare some kind of report as the one we developed within the iBRoad project. Showing the current building state, giving advice to the homeowner on detailed renovation steps, and preparing a roadmap which really helps the homeowner, even in stepwise renovations, to fulfill the overall target. And just very, very briefly, the philosophy behind this roadmap, because that's also important for the policy instruments around that. The philosophy is that on the one hand we have the very ambitious targets of the EPBD, we have the goal of the highly energy efficient and decarbonized building stock, but building components, when you renovate them, they have very long life cycles. So even today, when you do a renovation, also a stepwise renovation, so only one package maybe, you have to consider this very long-term target, and that's very difficult for the individual homeowner. And also on the other hand, many renovations are done step by step, and there are many things you can do wrong. And this leads to the third philosophy. So you really need some kind of overarching plan. For instance, if you renew the roof, it is a very good idea to think about a later wall insulation. So it might be good to have a roof overhang, but that's something typically people don't consider when they simply want to have a new roof. On the same, maybe it's a good idea to insulate the wall at the same time when you exchange the windows, because then you can place them here in the insulation layer, etc. So there are many even small things you might consider, and the renovation roadmap helps to think of them. Also, and that's the fourth element of the roadmap, it should not be just a generic energy consultancy, but it should be really help for the individual building owner. And so these trigger points, maybe the children coming or moving out, or money coming back from the rent insurance or whatever, these kind of things should be considered in the building roadmap. So let's assume now we do have a building roadmap, and the first thing that is necessary is you need the relevant infrastructure. So these are kind of prerequisites for the roadmap. You need, in the country where you want to implement the roadmap, some kind of software tool to calculate the building energy demand today and after the renovation steps. You need ideally a tool, or maybe it's the same software, many softwares include that, to calculate the renovation cost. If this is not available, there is help available on the iBRoad homepage, because the partners in the project also developed some tools to help with that. And also there is available the so-called roadmap assistant. Once you have these software tools, it helps you to produce very easily the report, and you don't have to worry about any graphics or any layout issues, etc. Second, of course, you need trusted and trained energy auditors. So you need to train the energy auditors to make them familiar with the principles and the tools of the roadmap. You need authorities organizing this process. So typically these could be energy agencies, national energy agencies, or regional ones, to administer this program and to also organize this auditor training. And ideally, it would be very helpful if you already have an existing program for building energy audits for individual buildings, especially for residential buildings, but you can also apply this for non-residential buildings with some adaptations. So this would be helpful because it, otherwise you have to use the roadmap as a trigger to set up such a program. And as I say, for the training and the technology, there is help available on the iBRoad homepage. But this is only the roadmap itself, and the next slides will focus more on the surrounding policies. So our hypothesis is that to make the roadmap really a tool with a lot of impact and a lot of renovation triggering, you need additional instruments, and these could be informational, these could be regulatory, or these could also be economic instruments. And I would like to give you a few examples from already existing supporting policies in the next slides. Well, the first thing is you need to make the roadmap a known product. So you need some kind of information. Of course, you can just put it on the national homepage of the government or the energy agency, but it's helpful to have an information campaign to really create a brand. And I think what is most important, to create a very clear contact point. So if there is a homeowner, he or she needs to know where to contact, whom to contact, where to find an energy auditor, who will help me, what is the next step. This campaign doesn't have to be generic. It can also target more focused, more specific target groups. For instance, in Germany, we are discussing target campaigns for elderly people, for instance, who need different kinds of information, different types of material that is currently now being developed. You can maybe also target people who want to exchange their old boiler. You can tell them, if you exchange the boiler and at the same time you do some kind of low threshold renovation packages, you can save money by having a smaller boiler. So this kind of information, for that you need a target-oriented campaign. So really, for instance, the heating installers can provide the information on the renovation roadmap if you want to do it at the same time. You can also integrate that into existing energy performance certificate schemes when they are required. For instance, we have one example in Portugal, for instance, where from the energy performance certificate there is some kind of EPC plus, so additional roadmap information contained in the EPC, so you can also use the information campaign or the information system of the EPC to promote the roadmap. Just to give you one example, there is in Germany a campaign, it's called Deutschland macht's effizient, Germany makes it efficient, and this campaign has a number of elements which basically prepare the way to getting a roadmap. So it really gives the contact information. It has an expert list of energy auditors for each region. You can search for the postal code, and also has information on funding schemes, etc. So it's really, in terms of information, a one-stop shop for the first step for channeling customers to the building roadmap. Now, the second thing you can do is, of course, you can have additional economic instruments. And one approach would simply be to support the roadmap and the energy audit itself financially. And this definitely increases the uptake and the market diffusion of the roadmap. It can be combined with this campaign, and you can thereby create, I think, quite a high demand for the roadmap. Again, the example from Germany, where you actually get financial support for the roadmap in a very high extent. Recently, it was increased from the beginning of this year to 80% of the cost for a roadmap, which would be a maximum of 1,300 euro for one family house. So that's the upper limit for the financial funding. Usually it's cheaper, but that's the upper limit. So by that, you have a very effectful instrument to trigger the demand for the roadmap itself, but you also can combine it with the list of trained auditors and you have a mechanism also to evaluate the roadmaps, because they then might have to be submitted to the authority to get the funding, and you can get a very good picture of what is happening in the market. The second financial approach would be to give a better financial support for the actual renovation measures. So not for the roadmap itself, but for what is done in the building, for the renovation works when they are recommended by a roadmap. There are various alternatives to do that. We focus on that in our report. For instance, you could have an additional funding when you already have a funding scheme for renovation works. For instance, 5% extra funding rate if you really implement measures that are recommended by a roadmap. And by that you make, on the one hand, the roadmap more attractive, but you also support measures that really follow this long-term pathway. So you have a two-way impact, both on the attractiveness of the roadmap, but also on the way and the quality and the renovation depth of the measures that are really done. One example for that is a local example in the city of Tübingen, again in Germany, where they give a lump sum bonus of 500 euro if a person does a renovation work and has a renovation roadmap and the measures are recommended in this roadmap, so you get an extra funding of 500 euro for this measure if it's recommended by the roadmap. You can also go one step further, and you can have the roadmap as a prerequisite for funding. The idea behind this is that you actually make sure that there will be no lock-in effects for the renovation measures. So in order to prove that what you want to get funded is really useful, you have to provide the roadmap, and you can by that show that you have a strategy for the building. There is a discussion, and we discussed it within by our Bulgarian partner Dragomir. And we had the idea to make the roadmap as a prerequisite for receiving credits for renovation and also for the implementation of the Smarter Finance for Families project, so where you get a green mortgage for the building. And the idea was to make the roadmap as a prerequisite here. There is, of course, a delicate balance you have to have here, because we do not want to put any additional barrier for renovation. So we have to make sure that this does not cause, an extra too big effort to apply for the funding, because we want to increase the renovation rate. We do not want to have additional problems here. So if you really do it on a low threshold level, I think it can be a very good idea to couple these two instruments together. And finally, there is an idea that has, for instance, been implemented in Austria in Vorarlberg. It is not really coupling the renovation roadmap and the funding scheme. It is a little bit more general, trying to combine a better funding for deep renovation kind of measures. So these would be those measures that are recommended by the roadmap. For instance, you would get a better funding if you have a package of renovation measures when you do two measures at the same time. For instance, when you insulate the outer wall and when you exchange the windows at the same time, you get a little bit better funding. Or if you increase or have a better U value for your insulation of the building envelope, or these kind of things. So there is a good example for this in Vorarlberg. It is a little bit, it is the same way of thinking as the renovation roadmap, and you can easily combine that with, supplying a roadmap as an energy audit in the first place, and then having this funding for renovation packages in the second stage. There are many more, alternatives and ways. These are just 4 examples for economic ways of supporting the roadmap. And finally, I would like to give a few ideas, a few examples how to implement the roadmap into regulatory measures as well. One I mentioned already in the beginning, like the Portuguese energy performance certificate, where the EPC, the simple EPC, is supplemented by additional information, tailored information based on really, an on-site energy consultancy. So you can build on the existing infrastructure for issuing the EPC, but you have the additional information from the roadmap. You can implement that also as a default, if you like. If you want to have a very powerful dissemination of the tool of the roadmap, you simply make it part of the EPC. So this could be one option, or you have a little bit less ambitious way of combining these. But connecting the EPC and the roadmap is a very good idea, because you have to be on site anyway, at least for certain types of EPCs, and you have to simply press one additional button and the EPC comes out. So this is, I think, a good idea to think of the roadmap in connection to the EPC. You can, of course, also make the roadmap mandatory. For instance, if certain trigger points, such as a change in property ownership happens, you could require people to have a roadmap. The advantage is it's a very clear mechanism. You would generate a very high number of roadmaps. But on the other hand, the disadvantages are that then the roadmap really becomes something, maybe unliked, because it's a requirement. So the acceptance might become a little bit lower. This relationship of trust between the homeowner and the energy auditor might be affected. So this has to be, weighed with each other. There is actually a very current example we discussed in Germany in the building code, whether there might be a mandatory energy audit in case of, for instance, a sale of a building, but probably this would not require a roadmap, because it is more work, but a more low threshold kind of audit. So this is really a discussion you have to do. There are advantages and disadvantages for making the roadmap mandatory. But there are also examples, such as in Austin, where at least when you've, for instance, prior to a sale of a building, or when the building is more than 10 years old, you have to provide some kind of energy audit to do that. And the third possibility, and again, there are a lot of options. You can be very creative here. There is one example, one very particular example in Baden-Württemberg, where we have a renewable heating obligation. That means that even in existing buildings, when a boiler is exchanged, the person owning that building has to use 15% of renewable energy. But instead of these 15%, part of this renewable heating obligation can also be fulfilled by other measures. And one of these measures could be by carrying out an energy audit. So actually, this is where the history of the individual building roadmap actually started, because we developed that some 8 years ago in the context of the Renewable Heating Act. So today, when you exchange your boiler, you can supply, or you can prepare a building roadmap for your building, and with that, you have 1/3 of this obligation for residential buildings fulfilled by having this long-term strategy for the buildings. The other 2/3 must still come from kind of hardware measures. And the advantage is that you trigger additional audits. The disadvantage is, again, a little bit like the approach 2, that a certain share of these roadmaps will be produced with, let me say, minimum efforts, just to fulfill the law. We actually evaluated these individual building roadmaps last year, and you could see that maybe 2/3 of the building roadmaps are very useful and helpful documents, really triggering and motivating for renovation, whereas 1/3 really looked like the kind of roadmap where you simply fulfill this requirement. So these are just a few examples to combine to support the building roadmap by other measures. And as I say, there are other ways of supporting that. Also, other variations of the measures I already told you. And what I would like to do in my one before the last slide is to briefly look at this as an overview. What we try to do here is to kind of evaluate the different measures in terms of the impact on the dissemination. So how known is the tool? How good is it? So what is the quality? Does it really lead to the implementation of additional measures? Does it support the renovation rate, the national renovation rate? And does it lead to additional renovation depth in the individual measures? We introduced here a kind of qualitative score from gray, no impact, to dark green with a very high impact. And we can see that the informational measures actually help to on the one hand, of course, to make the building known. The campaign, the auditors training improves the quality because the auditors know really what to do. Whereas the economic tools have a focus more on, well, on the one hand, also the dissemination, because it makes the building roadmap more attractive, but it also, makes the implementation more likely because people get some kind of reward, financial reward, when they have a building roadmap and then they implement this measure. And also, these economic measures are more likely to introduce a higher renovation rate and higher renovation depth because people get basically more support for that. Whereas the regulatory measures, where they really do increase the dissemination, the diffusion of the roadmap into the market, whereas we believe the impact on renovation rate and renovation depth might be still high, but not quite as high as in the sense of the economic measures. So this is only a very, rough qualitative assessment, especially for the regulatory assessments. It really depends on the country-specific conditions. So you really have to look in detail what is already available in place in terms of measures. So my conclusions would be that without surrounding policies, the roadmap will be an interesting consultancy approach, but it will not unfold its full impact. We need these information campaigns to trigger awareness and the quality. We need also at least one variation of the economic measures, at least in the beginning phase. You can also distinguish between sort of the initial phase of that tool and a later market phase. And regulatory measures really depend on the already existing national policy mix. So basically, we would like to invite you to take action to develop also your own country-specific roadmap approach and basically to try it out. Thank you very much so far.